Mr. Dunbar. Thank you.
Speaking about fancy introductions, I was reading today. Ruhiyyih Khanum tells a story about the guardian had sent her as his representative at the dedication of the house of worship here in the United States. And she says the chairman went on and on with all kinds of flowery praises and exalted things. So when she finally got to the microphone in a very characteristic way of Ruhiyyih Khanum herself, she said, "You know, after that introduction, I think I should have descended from heaven."
Your microphone is not on.
You sure?
Yeah, it is on. Okay, it is on.
It's one of those microphones that has to be right in your mouth.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not a pop singer, but I can try. Well, I think that the vignette was a very good introduction to speaking a little bit more about the hands of the cause of God. I think that was my cue.
That's the starting bell.
That's the starting bell. You know, I was hearing about the hands of the cause of the brand new Baha'i youth in 1956 to 1958. And during that time, I think the first hand of the cause that I saw was Amelia Collins. I was at a youth class in the LA Baha'i Center, and she had just met with the local assembly of Los Angeles. And she came out and went on her way. But as she came out, she smiled at the people who were outside. One of them was me. And her look was so heavenly. The light that beamed out of her face was so great that I said, I don't know, she's not having a meeting. There's no way to see her. I want to see her again. Then I heard she was going to meet with the youth in Phoenix a few days later. So we got a carload of youth and we drove from LA to Phoenix to meet Amelia Collins and to see what she was going to say. And it was a gathering in Nancy Phillips. Some of you know Nancy Phillips. She was a long-time board member. Nancy had opened her home. Amelia Collins met the youth there. I guess there were about 20 of us gathered. And she began speaking about the guardian, and the love that she had for the guardian just radiated out of her. Now, Amelia Collins, this is before modern glasses. She had some very heavy lenses on her eyes. So her eyes were already big and luminous, but by the time they got these glasses on, her eyes were pupils and everything was about that size, you know, so she's terrific, immediate presence. And she spoke about how Shoghi Effendi had so lovingly invited her to the Holy Land and then given her a room in the master's house. She was living in the home with Ruhiyyih Khanum and Shoghi Effendi. And she said that she would, because the guardian had to come down some wooden steps, a wooden non-permanent stairway had been made at the back of the hall, in the back of the house, when the Greatest Holy Leaf added some rooms on the roof of the house. It wasn't part of the original design where the guardian resided. And then that was enlarged and some additional third floor made at the front of the building after he married Ruhiyyih Khanum, and that was their quarters up there. So when the guardian was coming down, he'd walk on these wooden steps, she'd hear him, and wherever she was, she said she'd flee and go in her room so that he wouldn't have to bother himself to greet her and do what he would, of course, done. So it was very interesting how selfless she was in that sense. And he used to send her to, in the summer, which was very hot and humid in the Holy Land, send her to Arizona for a cure during the summer. So she would go there. That was how she happened to be in the area. And then she had some missions that she carried out as a hand of the cause. Now, Amelia Collins is the exception. You know, Baha'u'llah named hands of the cause. And they served him very faithfully, and then some of them survived Baha'u'llah, so they served as hands of the cause under the guardian, under Ammatu'l-Baha. And I think one of them lived on even into the guardianship just for a couple of years, but was already very old and weak. Then Shoghi Effendi didn't name any more hands of the cause, except posthumously. Some of the great teachers of the faith, he would say, and they have been worthy of the rank of hand of the cause of God. So there are a number of friends before he named living hands that were appointed in that manner. And one of them, the greatest one, as he said, was Martha Root herself. Let's see, you can name some of the others. Lewis Gregory, of course. And
Sears.
no, he was named a living hand. Roy Wilhelm. Anyway, as Paul Haney used to say, the hand of the cause, during our meetings at the teaching center, he said, that's a matter of fact, not opinion. We can find out. So then Shoghi Effendi in 1951 began naming living hands of the cause. He named several contingents, as they were called, groups of hands. And sometimes he'd name individual hands. For instance, when Varga Sr., that was the first trustee of the Hukuk, died, a distinguished hand of the cause, in the cable announcing his death, he announced his son as his successor, both in the Hukuk and as a hand of the cause. Interesting. And these hands of the cause, Shoghi Effendi invited to attend the conferences that he called at the beginning of the World Crusade as his representatives, and said as many of the hands should attend those meetings around the world as possible. And so the friends, a number of them met them. It was after that that I met the hand of the cause, Mr. Khadim, Zekrullah Khadim, and I met Dr. Ugo Giachery, who both of those gentlemen had great influence on my life. I was still quite young. The Guardian had sent Mr. Khadim to speak about the importance of the covenant and he came to Geyserville, which later, became the Bosch Baha'i School. And he spoke in such a sweeping, general way about the history of the covenant in the world. I was afraid of the subject of covenant breaking. I was a new Baha'i, we'd studied the Will and Testament, and some of the older friends were saying, oh, and there's covenant breakers in Los Angeles, and their breath will poison you if you get near them. And then one of them sidles up to me, a brand new, about to become a Baha'i, and says, there's one of them on Larchmont Boulevard, right near you. Scared the bejesus out of me. So I didn't want to hear about covenant breaking at all. But Mr. Khadim gave the whole history of it and described how in the Old Testament it's been referred to as leprosy. And it's a spiritual illness of the soul that turns against the light and attacks the light. So you want to stay out of the way of covenant breakers. I know some of you have had experience. Montana is a bit famous for its history of covenant breaking. But fortunately, they were very crazy covenant breakers. I think it makes it easy. Some of them are more rational, apparently more rational. In the history of the teaching center, I was there for 15 years, more people came back into the cause than got expelled. There were very few covenant breakers since the establishment of the House of Justice. And many people, particularly the followers of the covenant breakers, have become Baha'is. That is, they heard about it from covenant breakers, and then eventually they got it straight that there's a real Baha'i faith, and they switched over. So it's a history of great blessing for the House of Justice that it's been free from that kind of thing from the beginning. You heard that I had the great honor of attending the first international convention for the election of the Universal House of Justice in 1963 in Haifa. And of course, all of the hands of the cause that were alive and able were at that conference. So, you ended up shaking hands with Mr. Samandri, who had shaken hands with Baha'u'llah. It's that close. Amazing. And I didn't know that at the time, in 63, at the time, that already in the conclave they had talked to the meetings of the hands that had that I was to be appointed an auxiliary board member. Some of them were meeting me for the first time, and I was so young, I think they must have thought, this is the guy they wanted to appoint. I was 27 when I went on the board for protection. And it was for the whole hemisphere. So I got assigned 5 countries protection. Friends, every one of the 5 had covenant breaking. The chairman of the NSA of one country broke the covenant. The treasurer of another country. These were still being seduced by Mason Remy's claims and things. It was an exciting time, and it's not in Baha'i news anyplace. That was a terrific training for going to Haifa and learning the history of things there. So also when we were pioneering in Nicaragua, in such a remote place, we had visitors from Dr. Giachery came to Bluefields. The Hand of the Cause, Carlos Featherstone came to Bluefields. Dr. Muhajir came to Bluefields. Enoch Olinga came to Bluefields. Now, some of the times when Dr. Giachery came, I was still a lone pioneer there. After a while, a few other pioneers arrived. And it was such a remote area, and we were hosting him and trying to arrange meetings for such a distinguished man. And somehow there's a magic connected with them that when I went out and told this was a predominantly African background, Caribbean background population in Bluefields, at least 85%. But I went and told these friends that there's this gentleman, he's a count from Italy, but he is from the aristocracy of Italy, of Sicily, that he's going to speak, and a crowd showed up. I was astonished, and I had some meetings with people, but there were about 30 of them. And Dr. Giachery somehow, instead of talking about the Baha'i faith generally, he spoke about the guardian and the love he had for the guardian and the accomplishments of the guardian. And these people had tears in their eyes listening to him, just hearing about the love of this individual and appreciation for another person. It was really a powerful experience. And Mr. Olinga, I took him in canoes up rivers into the rainforest, and we met with a native community there, and he dedicated a local Baha'i center that they'd made out of watling. Do you know what watling is? Watling, where you split the branches and you weave the branches in between sticks and you make a house out of it, and then you put a palm roof on it. It was the first Baha'i center of eastern Nicaragua. And he spoke so lovingly to the people that he had been appointed by the House to the election, representing the World Center, to the election of the first National Assembly of Cuba. And after that, Panama, 2 weeks later. So this was an interesting thing. I met him in Panama also, and was among a group that took him to see the Panama Canal locks, which he was very interested in. Mr. Olinga, what an extraordinary gentleman. Later on, he came to visit South America. I traveled with him, for a week or so in Nicaragua. And then when he came to South America, I was a counselor at that time, and the board asked me to accompany him in his journey. It was complicated for him, the visas and things, and he didn't speak the language, and there was a question of visas and exchange of money and all the other complications you can imagine. So I already lived there 10 years anyway in Latin America. So I did that and translated his talks in all different circumstances. Again, in the rainforests of Colombia, in the forests of Chile, in the south of Chile, in the mountains of Bolivia, in university platforms. I remember we'd been in a village in Bolivia, meeting with friends and slept overnight in a chocito, a little rock hut, looked like a rock igloo, which had more creatures inside than out. apart from distinguished visitors. And then we got enough. There was no transport in the area, so we got on top of a truck that was filled with sacks, filled with coca leaves, the basis of cocaine, great product of that area. And it was so dusty, and there were chickens tied to the sides of the truck. I thought Mr. Olinga was going to fall off. The guy who was driving on this bumpy dirt road, swinging around corners and stuff as they did in Bolivia. But somehow we got there completely covered by dust, and he let us off at the door of the university. We had an appointment that day at the university. We didn't know exactly what it would consist of, but they had already planned, without our knowledge, for him to give a public meeting for the university students and anyone else who wanted to attend. And it turns out that it was to start in about 7 minutes. So we were brushing the dust off ourselves, not looking really ready for a public meeting, and the rector announced, "We're so pleased that you're here, and we've arranged for your talk, which, by the way, the subject is science and religion, to be broadcast nationally on national radio."
Praise be to Allah.
I looked at Mr. Olinga. He smiled, as he did characteristically, about everything. And we went in, and he gave this glorious talk, and I was taking some notes to do the translation. I thought, oh, this talk is perfect. This has got to be a talk of Ammatu'l-Baha. And I asked him about it. I said, sounds like a talk of Ammatu'l-Baha. He didn't say anything, but later he told me, he said when he was on pilgrimage, the guardian had told him, you must master Ammatu'l-Baha's approach to teaching in the West. It cannot be surpassed. And he'd become that, like the incarnation. Public meetings, he had a certain stance and a certain way he talked. When he was with groups of Baha'is, he was so revealing about spiritual realities and the nature of the soul. I swear, as far as I was concerned, he was the deepest of the hands of the cause I met, and I met almost all of them. Others were they spoke well, they were inspiring and uplifting, but he seemed to come out with the depths of knowledge about things that, anyway, it was a great appeal to me. And it was such a bounty to travel with him. He had a very keen sense of humor. He was easily ignited into laughter. And he was a big man, and his laughter was big. I remember one time in a restaurant, he got laughing. And also, he had swings of mood, and sometimes get a little sad. And since I knew about this, I would bring up one of these laugh points with him, and then he'd start laughing. He was laughing, and he couldn't stop laughing. And I was goading him on a little bit. And the next thing we know, the table next to us, they started laughing. And the table beyond them, the whole restaurant ended up hysterically laughing and laughing. Talk about infectious laughter. There was an interviewer in Cusco, in Peru, up in the mountains, a radio interviewer, and he was taken with the name Olinga, he would say. Senor Enoch Olinga. And we laughed about that. And some 5 weeks after Mr. Olinga left South America, went on to Central America, and there were other counselors to take care of him. I wanted to keep going with him, but I had to stop at that point. He wrote a letter to me from the Caribbean islands, and I think it was from Barbados actually. And I opened the letter, and he says, "Dear Hooper." Now that letter's in my archives. Somebody's going to find it and say, "What in the world?" But I knew what the reference was. He was just terrifically made a plan to meet in Africa. He was going to take me to the places where he'd taught the masses in the Congo. But very tragically, he and his family, were murdered in Uganda. Not faith-related in the sense, faith-related because, well, he was there because he was a Baha'i, but there were intrigues amongst the government people, and every night a prominent family was being murdered. And he was, their family was on the list. It was very tragic. Mr. Banani, of course, was the first hand of the cause in Africa. And Mr. Banani was a good businessman, but he was illiterate. He couldn't read and write. Though he had quite some independent wealth because of his shrewd business sense. He was of Jewish background, and he felt so unworthy as a pioneer and everything. But the Guardian said he was the heart of Africa. And when he was on pilgrimage, he named him a Hand of the Cause. So I've elevated you to the rank of Hand of the Cause. And he began saying, "Oh no, Shogi Effendi, not me. Ali," he says, trying to get Ali Nakjavani appointed. He said, his time is coming. I didn't appoint him. And he had a hard time kind of registering that. Well, when Mr. Olinga was on pilgrimage, the Guardian spoke about the greatness of Musa Banani, who'd gotten up from, without the language and with not feeling prepared, and went off and established himself in Uganda. And he said Uganda was the heart of Africa, and Musa Banani was the heart of Africa. Musa Banani had diabetes, he had problems, he had to have a leg amputated. He said he went to the funeral of his own leg. They buried it up on the mountain near the temple. He said, "Bye for now, I'll be joining you shortly."
That's great.
So he went to heaven in 2 stages. Friends, one after the other, you heard about John Robarts. John Robarts had such a heart, such a throbbing heart, and he was so keen about spiritual matters. He set afire to the whole Canadian community when one visit he made back, talking about the long obligatory prayer and suggesting to the friends that they try it and they would see what a benefit it had for them and so on. And there's a whole little booklet of people who responded to that and the kind of changes that took place in their lives through John. He just had that effect on everyone. Bill Sears, of course, was there, and he came in and out of the Holy Land. The teaching center consisted of all of the Hands of the Cause and initially 3 counselors that were added to the teaching center to form the body of 7. 4 permanent members that lived in the Holy Land were Ruhiyyih Khanum, Mr. Furitan, Mr. Faizi, and Mr. Haney. And then we joined them, Florence Mayberry, Aziz Yazdi, and myself. The result of that was that in 78, when the Hands gathered for their last conclave, they told us that the Hands had decided that the 3 counselor members were doing their work with them. They should also be in the conclave. So results, I'm the only one left now of that meeting that took place. But we sat 3 days and heard the Hands consulting together about the work of the cause and where it was going and their own services. So it was terrific. It was not an easy transition for the Hands. They pulled us through the crusade and elected the House of Justice and handed the cause to the House of Justice. And the House writes in its messages, we've never seen that kind of selfless sacrifice on the part of people who were actually in control. I mean, they could have decided it's still early for the House, we'll run the cause for it, but they didn't do that. And consequently, their own role came under the House of Justice in the absence of the Guardian. Everything was directed by the House. And they once, when they consulted, they said, how would we know who might be future Hands? Because they weren't sure whether the House would find a way to appoint Hands of the Cause after the passing of the Guardian. And they said we compared our kind of background And we couldn't find any similarities between the hands. There was not any similarity. We were all so distinct and different in our backgrounds. The only thing we find in the end was we were all in love with the guardian and devoted to him and ready to do anything he asked of us. We were his hands. He could work with, he could do things around the world. It's a terrific analogy. And of course the house found it with the wording of the Will and Testament. In the absence of the guardian, there was no way to appoint hands. But the functions of the hands were not infallible in character, and so the house could legislate that the functions of the propagation and protection of the faith as vested in the institution of the hands of the cause could be perpetuated through the boards of counselors, and that was what happened there. Then visiting hands would come to the Holy Land and meet with with our body there in the International Teaching Center. What other hands can I tell you about? Anybody want to ask about any particular? Mr. Khanum was...
Mr. Ioas was there.
Because Mr. Ioas, I met him in the Holy Land in '63. That was the only time that I did meet him. And he was at the World Congress. The hands were on the stage. Ruhiyyih Khanum was there. She'd spoken. Crowds rushed up on the stage after she spoke at the end of the session. And I was up high in the auditorium, so Royal Albert Hall, could see that the push was pushing Khanum right to the edge of the platform. And in the process, Leroy Ioas fell down and got trampled. It was terrible. We had to have some strong-armed Baha'is. They went in and formed a circle around Khanum and got her out. Most of this were just overzealous, loving Persian friends who'd never had access to Ruhiyyih Khanum or seen Ruhiyyih Khanum. Much excitement about that. When she spoke at the Congress, maybe you've heard the recordings, it was as if Shoghi Effendi appeared as a vision in front of our eyes. It was so moving and touching. And she held herself together, to give that talk, but about halfway through, at one moment it was too much and she started weeping. And the Africans spontaneously started singing Allahu-Akbar. And she gathered herself and went on with her talk. Everything we read certainly gives you a fairly full description of that, but being close to Khanum in the Holy Land, working with her every day, life just wasn't the same at all without the guardian there. And she was cheerful and so on, but she still had this sorrow of missing him. Mr. Haney was a tower of strength. He's a Washington economist. He'd been chairman of the NSA here for years. Very capable, very orderly mind. He knew all the precedents of the instructions of the hands to the counselors. He was the chairman of the meeting most of the time. He and Ruhiyyih Khanum alternated as in chairing the teaching center. And I never heard him say anything critical of anybody. This is a pretty good record, when you're in a place where you're getting news about people doing strange things they shouldn't be doing. Along with all the good news, you had a fair proportion of, who had done what and what had happened to them and all that kind of stuff. House of Justice, of course, got its different news of that sort too.
Who were the last two?
The last two hands?
Yes.
Dr. Varga was the last one. Yeah, and I don't know, did Furtan go before Khanum? I can't remember.
No, Mr. Furtan went after her.
After, so they were the last two then.
I went on pilgrimage in November of 2002. There were just the men.
Yeah, that would be Furtan and Varga. Yeah. Mr. Furtan, he had given a talk to the pilgrims, and then the pilgrims had gone for some refreshments, except a group of Russian pilgrims who were there. And he was speaking Russian with them. And he stepped off the platform and took a few steps and had an attack and died right there with his boots on, so to speak. Which I think was just what he would have wanted. That was amazing. Dr. Varga lasted quite well to the end too, and faded. It was quite an epoch, the whole period of Hands of the Cause, from Baha'u'llah to right to Dr. Varga's passing. Amazing. A sweet man, such a dear man. I used to visit him a lot as a house member, kind of fill him in on what was going on, the latest news we had, and so on. Nobody had time to do that, very much time. And he'd get a little bit isolated, and he was busy with his hukuk work, and he always met with the pilgrims as well till the end. Amazing. Dare I tell you a dream, just as a personal thing, but it's an interesting, before I went to the Holy Land, I'd been in the jungles of Ecuador, down in the back, Colombian Ecuador, meeting some tribal peoples, and I got in some kind of stomach infection. Didn't feel good at all, but had managed to fly back to Buenos Aires. I was in Buenos Aires and kind of resting up. And I had this dream that I was in Holy Land, in front of the shrine of the Bab. The guardian was speaking Persian to the Persian friends, and I was amongst the Persian pilgrims. I've been trying to learn a little Persian, not very successful. But in the dream, I was understanding what Shogi Effendi was saying. And at one point he looked over and winked at me, see, you're understanding Persian, you know? That was the first part of the dream. Then the dream transferred to the paths that Shogi Effendi had laid out where the House of Justice was to be built on the mountain. He's showing me where the House of Justice is going to be. Why he's doing that, I don't know, but anyway, he was doing it. We were walking, and as we were walking, he turned back to me, and he reached with his hand, and he put his two fingers on the back of, reached about the back of my head, touched me on the back of the head, and I felt healing go through me. So I said, that's wonderful. Then I thought to myself, you know, he's right here, and I would be not looking at him directly, and I just wanted to look in his face. I just said, I'm going to look. And I looked, and he was smiling with this benefic smile, so beautiful. And as I was watching him, the radiance grew until he was like a moon, and the features disappeared off of the face. There was just the light that was left. I'm looking at that, and then I see other eyes and nose and mouth appearing on his face with the same look. That disappeared. Another face came. That disappeared. Another face came. About the fourth one, I got it. These were the faces of the men of the House of Justice that he was showing me on his face with that same expression. And as soon as I got that, his own smile came back, and he smiled in the dream end.
Had you ever heard the Persian? I don't know if it was more than a rumor that any dreams of the central figures were not dreams.
Well, I think they are very real kind of experiences, but you know, sometimes you have some silliness in a dream. You don't know what the meaning of it is. Can't be sure, but I've heard that. That's not just what they say. It's a tablet of the master says something like that, affirms that experiences with the central figures are real experiences. How that works, I don't know, but this is before I was a counselor. Before I went to the election in '73, and before I was appointed to the teaching center. I was in Yazd the day the teaching center was announced to Baha'i World on a pilgrimage, and there I'd just been visiting the graves of the martyrs with some of the Afnan and other distinguished believers there in Yazd. That was a terrific experience. And that was the same day that the appointment came, and nobody could communicate it to us because Yazd, they couldn't telephone there and they couldn't telegraph there. It was all too dangerous. I met the local assembly in a barn in the middle of the night with a candle. It was like that, you know.
What year was that?
73. Yeah. Then there's a smaller assembly area inside Yazd that had its own assembly. Mariamabad, maybe some of you have heard of that. Mariamabad had its own assembly. They wanted to meet with me. They said, I met with the other assembly and they wanted me. So they said the best thing is you come and sleep in Mariamabad and we'll visit you in the morning. So that was fine. And I was in a small cot in a small room, and it was dark, and I opened my eyes. I felt somebody's here, you know? And there was the assembly sitting around me in the dark while I was asleep, waiting for me to wake up so they could go out in the dark and go get back to their homes and activities unperceived. So we had a prayer together and talked a little bit. Meet the assembly in your bed, huh? That's some unique experiences.
What year was that?
73.
Wow.
73.
Yeah, June 73.
10 years in.
And I was the guest of the Afnan. Mr. Nakchivani had arranged through some of the Persian friends, members of the NSA, that I could have a pilgrimage. I was still a counselor for South America at that time. And they'd arranged for me to go everywhere. And the Afnan, who was the caretaker of the house of the Bab in Shiraz, his family was in England. His wife and daughters were in England visiting. So he said, you stay with me at my house. So I went to the house every day, went to the house of the Bab from his house. And I was there for the declaration of the Bab. And since I was a guest of the Afnan go to the room at 2 hours after 2 hours and 11 minutes after sunset on the declaration. The Afnan family, the family of the Bab, they were there. Then they invited me to come as a visitor, so I was there with them. And they start reading the same thing that the Bab revealed, the Qayyum al-Asma. They chanted it, the first chapter, as the commemoration in the room itself. Yes.
When is the Bayan coming out?
Once the cause of Baha'u'llah is championed in the whole world, the book of Allah, according to the master's instructions. I mean, scholars have translations. You can read it in Persian if you want.
Oh, thank you.
And of course, there's extracts that have been published in the writings of the Bab, so that gives you, and much of the first chapter is already there. But there's harsh laws. The Bab introduced harsh laws to really shock the clergy, in Iran. And Shoghi Effendi said that they were revealed and were made dependent upon the confirmation of him whom God will make manifest. So that nobody could act on those laws. So they were they were cosmetic but dramatic for the clergy. But the enemies of the faith, if they get those and publish them independently, if it says that if it's the will of him whom God will make manifest, in those central provinces, no one but believers can live, and anybody else should be driven out of those provinces. So things like that they said, what? That would have been all the clergy too. Anyway, those books, they're not secret, but they're not propagated and printed and promulgated.
One time I had a copy in English of the Nahjul Balagha, the book of Ali. Was that ever a significant accompaniment to the Quran?
It was a well-known work. The works of Ali, of course, are revered by the Shias, not so much by the Sunnis, even though he became one of the caliphs afterwards. I don't think the Baha'is haven't. We're just getting some decent translations of those. Of some of the Shia imams, that Baha'u'llah affirms that they were divinely inspired, and their writings have significance, but most of them are fairly esoteric in character. Let's see, who else would you know about Hands of the Cause? I want to, because Ruhiyyih Khanum told me that Leonora Armstrong, who was the first pioneer to South America. Martha Root was the first travel teacher to South America, but the first settler in South America was Leonora Armstrong. And she had been at it for years, Martha gave her her diary when she came back from South America, the addresses and names of people who had shown interest in the faith during her visit. And Leonora had been there. She died, and she's buried in Bahia. And Khanum said that the Guardian had a short list of people that he was looking at to name as Hands of the Cause, and her name was on it. But didn't get to that stage. But she had that quality. He called her the Baha the Peter of South America, and the spiritual mother of Latin America. And the house confirmed that in their cable at her passing, that she was the spiritual mother of South America. She was a very humble, self-effacing woman. She constantly said, I haven't done anything. I've just been here, but I haven't done anything. And I wish, it's so good you young people are coming and are doing things for the cause. I was a counselor. I was a little embarrassed. So I started probing her about the things she hadn't done. And she began talking a little bit. And she tells these stories. She said, probably the most interesting part was, she said, I went up the Amazon twice, from the mouth of the Amazon up to Manaus. So by that time, everything was by boat. There wasn't much flying around. And first I should tell you, when she came to Brazil, she came on a second-class steamer, second class on the steamer. She visited with people and so on. She had enough money in her purse to last 2 weeks. That's not a place you turn around and go back from, fly home tonight or cable for more money or something like that. Nothing like that. She was just completely put herself in the hands of Baal. She knew about this fellow in Santos, who is quite interested in the faith. She said she got to Rio, and she said, okay, I have this address in Santos. And they said, Santos is not here, it's another city. You have to take another ship. She had to invest more money to go down the coast further to Santos. She asked for the man, she found him right away. He assessed her situation, I'm sure, and said, let me hire you as the English teacher of my 2 daughters. So she had room in the basement, she said, which was pretty exciting, of this house. And she taught English to the daughters and got herself situated as an English teacher and was, of course, able to stay. But she says, I ate an awful lot of rice and banana over and over and over again. Now, while she was in Santos, she received a letter. The letter on the envelope said Leonora Armstrong, Brazil. And up in the sender it said Abbas Effendi, Ammatu'l-Baha Abbas Effendi. Ammatu'l-Baha sent her a letter to her name in Brazil. And she gets it. Now you tell me, miracles in the cause. So the letter comes, and it comes to the post office, and the post office sees this in English. Miss Leonora, okay, she must be British, so they sent the letter to the British Embassy. The British Embassy says, we never heard of her. So they said, well, send it to the American Embassy. They sent it to the American Embassy. They said, we've never heard of her, but we'll put it up on our bulletin board, where people are passing. And another passenger from the ship, from America, saw this letter there, and she said, oh, she's in Santos. And they sent it to the consul in Santos. The consul in Santos had heard of her presence there, because there weren't very many Americans visiting or going there, and sent the letter over to her, and she gets it. And he's praising her for her work, and he says, I'm praying that you may become a spiritual nurse to heal the souls of the ailments of self and passion. My goodness. Meanwhile, now later she's in the north. She's gone to Bahia, which was the city mentioned in the Divine Plan. That's one of the only cities mentioned in the Divine Plan. And she's gone on to Bahia, to the Belém, and gone up the river. And I said, well, how did it go? And she showed me an album of newspaper clipping. Angel of Light arrives in Kumkansa or wherever it was, these little towns. And then the neighboring towns would hear that she was coming, and the people were all like, Ammatu'l-Baha says in a tablet that's quoted in Advent of Divine Justice, he says that when a Baha'i enters the city, it should shake the whole town. Everyone should know about it. They should know, verily, this is a Baha'i. Look, this is the representative of the Baha'i teaching. So these people were just so enamored of her, and she had such a sweet nature. And I'm sure she was confirmed in that. I mean, she's first Baha'i moving up that mighty river. Amazing. She said they wanted me to heal them. I didn't know what to do. But she says I bought aspirins and I'd cut them in little pieces and I'd give a little piece of aspirin.
Probably cured them all.
And she'd have these interviews about the teachings with the newspapers. Okay. She goes on to Manaus. Manaus is in its heyday, so this is this is 2021, she's still received something from the master, but maybe this is a year or so later. Manaus, after the war, was quite a wealthy city because of rubber. And the rubber barons just made a fortune in the First World War. So much so that they missed their beloved Europe. A number of them were Europeans. They had workers come and build the Paris Opera House in Manaus. A duplicate of the Paris Opera House is in the middle of the Amazon. And then they would contract the world's great opera singers to come and sing opera for them. So that was there. Anyway, Leonora arrives, and I said, did you know anyone there? And she said, no, I didn't. But she said, so I did like Martha Ruth. I went and found the mayor, and I told him I'd come to your city and I have a message that I'd like to deliver to the people. And he said, what's your message? And he heard the message, and he said, this is very important. He said, I'll call a meeting for the people. And he called a meeting in the opera house. So you know about public meetings. Baha'i public meetings are not always well attended. In this case, she said it was full. 2,000 people came. And I said, well, what happened after that? She said, well, we said there'd be a study class for those that were interested to know more. I said, so how did that go? She said, oh, not so many came. Only 400 came to
that. Seven nights a week, 2 shifts each.
She says, I have to confess to you, I've never told anybody this. I wonder, what's she going to confess? She says, I'm not a speaker. It frightens me to try to speak. I can't speak. Yes. She said, so you know what I did? She said, I memorized Ammatu'l-Baha's talks and some tablets from the gleanings, and I'd use those. And it seemed to work very well. So I was able to tell her about how Shoghi Effendi had encouraged mastering Ammatu'l-Baha's, and which would be fine. I memorized his talks and use those. Why not? Terrific. She said, then I said, so what happened next? She said, well, the mayor said, we've left the children out. So we'll make arrangements for you to go to the schools and lecture at all the schools so the children can hear this wonderful message too. Shortly, a volume, which I thank Baha'u'llah, I was involved in collecting the letters of Shoghi Effendi to Latin America. That's the missing set of letters in all the publications of the Guardian's letters. And it's finished, and it's in the press in Wilmette right now. The house did final editing of the whole volume and so on. And it's the biggest of the volumes, 300 pages, I think, of all those early messages. And in it, it has the message to institutions, and it has individuals, and all the letters that the Guardian wrote to Leonora, which was, was more than a dozen of them. I can't remember at the moment the exact number, but at least a dozen. instructing her in what to do and guiding her to translate the Kitab-i-Gan in Portuguese, all kinds of things. I lost the strand. What was I going to tell you? Wait a second now. So, the letters she wrote to him were when she was depressed. Oh, Shoghi Effendi, I'm so distressed. I have no capacity for this. I have no success. Of course, there were no enrollments in those days. They didn't know what an enrollment was. These people all loved the faith or heard about it. But she never wrote the Guardian about those Amazon trips. So he would write back in sweet terms, consoling her, don't worry, the seeds that you're planting will bear fruit, and you'll see all these letters. And you realize that she hid all of her accomplishments. This is incredible, really incredible.
When did she die?
80,
Yeah,
1980,
very old.
1981. Yeah. She had cancer, and she didn't like doctors very much, so she didn't go. She collapsed in Rio, and they took her to the hospital and pulled off. And she had a gaping hole in the side of her cancerous hole. I mean, I can't imagine how nice that felt. She was still teaching the faith and talking to people in the bus stations and stuff. But she got over that. She was healed of that. And she went and lived the last years of her life after her husband died. She was in very dire straits for a long time until she met a British gentleman who wanted to marry her. He wasn't a Baha'i, but he had the means to support her and so on. And she already had adopted about 12 children. She'd pick up stray babies off the street that were abandoned and start taking care of them. It's a long history of that. It's an amazing lady. And with him, she got a farm, and she produced a farm, and then she had properties and so on. That's the stage that I met her. John, yeah?
I'd like to put a postscript on her death. In Alaska at the time, we were trying to get St. Lawrence Island settled, which is closer to Russia than it is to mainland Alaska. And Pioneer William Bergamaschi went out there for a short time, but there was no work and very difficult situation. He was living with a half-brother of his, and it got to the point where the two families couldn't live together, and so he had to leave. And the National Assembly decided the only thing they could do was to have him build a house. And there were people who had experience in designing houses in wilderness in remote situations. But the only thing that was lacking was money. But with her death, a relative got some money and heard about the distress. And so she was able to provide the funds to build the house in the Ruhiyyih Khanum visited later on in Zerunga, Alaska. So she covered house like say from one end of the
Hemisphere to the other, yeah, that's terrific. That's interesting, yes. There's another biography has been written in Portuguese already and translated to Spanish. We don't have an English version of it yet, but there's another biography that her grandniece is writing that will eventually come out and has more about her non-South American life prior to that. She said Martha was encouraging me to go. She said I didn't know what to do. I went to see my friend May Maxwell, who was in bed in New York, lying down. She said I came in and I asked. She said, how are you doing? Fine. She said, but I've got this challenge. I don't know. I'm being encouraged by Martha to go to South America. What do you think? And she said, May Maxwell sat straight up in bed. And she said, what are you waiting for? So we have May Maxwell connected also very closely to, of course, Ruhiyyih Khanum knew her and was most interested in visiting.
You all know Giachery from Barbados. She was also one of the very first travel teachers to set foot in Barbados.
Yes, that's another thing. She opened a number of countries. You know, she would have been Knight of Baha'u'llah for a whole lot of them if that wasn't the case at that time. She also was the first visitor to Guyana and to Venezuela. And I think there's other other islands. Every place she went, she'd go and proclaim the faith. And she followed Martha Root's pattern. And in Guyana, she went to the mayor, and the mayor set up a big meeting. First day she was there, the ship is going on its way, and she's proclaiming the faith. It was lovely. Well, friends, this here, the great achievements of these heroes and heroines of the faith. By the way, one of the answers that I use, why are there no women on the House of Justice, is because Baha'u'llah said there should be no women. It's a legislative body, and he limited it to men. But there have been women that have far surpassed the position of House of Justice members. They were hands of the cause. The Guardian said the hands of the cause were his cabinet. They were, think of the position of cabinet members to members of the Congress. There's a difference. And great women have opened the cause in the West. And the whole galaxy of Baha'i immortals that Shoghi Effendi refers to in his writings lists women, all women except Haydn. The only man in there is Haydn. Otherwise, you've got, Lua and May Maxwell. Who else? Martha Root, of course, and Dorothy Baker eventually is added to that too.
Lua Giachery.
Yeah, mentioned her first. She's right on the top of the list. We have to look it up. It's a matter of fact, not opinion, as Mr. Haney would say when the memory lapses. Thanks very much, friends. Nice to talk to you, and we'll see you again in the morning.